So what's up, guys? We're getting into Chapter 7 of the Royal Ranger Book 1, New Beginning. As you might recall from Chapter 6, Gillen has been having some trouble with Will getting him to do missions. And they suggested, the council there, a solution of giving an apprentice, and Halt, right at the end of the chapter, suggested that it be Madeline, the Crown Princess, who becomes his apprentice. So, coming off of that, into Chapter 7, let's get it started. Suddenly, everyone was talking at once. "Madeline? You mean my Madeline?" Cassandra cried, coming half to her feet. "You must be joking, Halt," said Horace. "But she's a girl." That was Gillen. Halt waited until they all fell silent, and then he answered them calmly. "Yes, Cassandra, I do mean your Madeline. And no, I'm not joking, Horace. And yes, Gillen, I am aware that Madeline is a girl." He noticed that alone among those in the room, his wife had said nothing. He glanced sideways at her and was not surprised to see that she was nodding her head thoughtfully. He gave her a brief smile. The others were all still totally nonplussed by his suggestion. Cassandra had fallen back into her chair as she realized he was serious. He spoke to her now. "Evelyn," he said, "like Will. Holt usually used that name for her in private. It was a mark of affection between them. Let's just think about something. If you had a son instead of a daughter, what would he be doing now?" "I didn't have a son," she began, but he held up his hands to still her protest. "Just humor me. Let's say, hypothetically, you have a son. How would you be preparing for him for his future as the ruler of Aurelian?" Cassandra bit her lip. She could see what he was angling at. She refused to give his suggestion any support. Horace answered for her. "He'd be in the army," he said in a flat tone. Cassandra whipped around and glared at him. "Horace!" she cried accusingly. But Horace, tall and practical and honest, shrugged at her. There was no avoiding the answer. Halt nodded gently, his eyes still fixed on Cassandra as she turned back to him. She flushed. He could see that she regretted the sudden surge of anger she had directed at her husband. "That's right," he said. "Probably in a cavalry regiment. You would have trained him with the sword and the lance for the past few years, I would think, Horace." Horace nodded a little regretfully. During the time of Cassandra's pregnancy, he had nursed visions of training a son to ride and wield a sword and a lance like his father. When Cassandra delivered a daughter, he felt a moment of shocked surprise. He simply never considered that possibility. It has to be said that this was quickly overcome by a deep-seated, lasting pleasure at the prospect of raising a daughter. But he remembered those long-ago dreams now. Halt continued. "Probably be a junior officer, commanding a squad, learning how to lead men in combat, how to make life-or-death decisions. And I would guess that you wouldn't insist that he be kept away from combat. You'd recognize that he would have to be seen as a leader who shared danger with the men he commanded. Maybe he'd be assigned a term of picket duty in the north, protecting against Scotty raiders. Or he'd be patrolling the southwest coast, fighting smugglers and moondarkers." He paused, looking at the two of them. Horace was looking resigned, as if he agreed that this was what a son of his would be expected to do. Cassandra's lips were pressed together in a thin, stubborn line. What he wouldn't be doing would be sitting in a big, comfortable castle, surrounded by hundreds of men-at-arms, and never knowing what it was like to face danger, to pit himself against an enemy, and come out on top. Gillen opened his mouth to say something, but Halt held up a hand to stop him. He knew what Gillen's objection was, but he'd deal with that in a minute or two. "So why should your daughter be any different?" he asked. Cassandra's eyes flashed up to meet his. "Because she is my daughter," she snapped. "Do you expect her to go into the army and lead a platoon of cavalry?" "No," Halt said in a reasonable tone. "But I think joining the Rangers would be a logical alternative. She'd learn to command, to make decisions, to judge a situation and come up with the right answers at the right time. As for the more physical side of battle, well, we Rangers have always tended to step back and leave that to the bashing whackers like Horace. No offense," he added with a small smile. Horace shrugged. "I recall you taking your place in the battle line more than once, Halt." Halt nodded. "I have, but it's not absolutely necessary for a ranger to do it. That was usually just vanity on my part." "But even so, you admit that there would be danger?" Cassandra said. Halt turned to her. "Of course. We live in a dangerous world. When you're dead and gone and Madeline inherits the throne, there will be people who won't want her there. They'll have their own agendas and their own candidates for rule. If they think they're dealing with a helpless girl, they'll try to take advantage of the fact. They might be a little more reluctant if they knew that she was trained as a ranger, and had the backing of the entire corps. We tend to look after one another, you know." Cassandra considered his words. Aurelian was at peace, but she was aware that there were still elements in the kingdom who would be ready to rebel at the slightest sense of weakness from their ruler. And any change of ruler could always precipitate a power struggle among ambitious people. Cassandra's own reputation and Horace's skill as a warrior were enough to keep such elements at bay. The people of Araluan were aware that their future queen was not one to be browbeaten or suborned in any way. Any rebellion against her would be quickly snuffed out. But Maddie? What would she bring to the throne? What would her reputation be? She saw now that Halt's description of her as a helpless girl was all too accurate. Of course, she would have advisors and supporters, but Cassandra knew that the true strength of the throne came from the ruler herself. For her ability, her confidence, her skill and experience in dealing with tough and frightening situations. But still. But the danger, Halt. How can I place my little girl in danger? What if she's injured? She said, her voice miserable. What if she's hurrying to a needlepoint class, trips on the hem of her long, girly skirt, falls down the stairs, and breaks her neck? Halt asked her. You can't mollycoddle her. He paused, remembering his conversation with Duncan. Your father said that things are going to be tough for you when you inherit the throne, he said. They're going to be even tougher for Maddie. She may not find someone like Horace to support her. Halt leaned forward and took Cassandra's hands. You'd be placing her in the care of the greatest, most capable ranger Araluan has ever known, he said quietly. He sensed the surprise among the others and looked up at them. So, Will's better than I ever was, he said, smiling. Once his vanity might not have allowed him to say that, but now the words came easily. Maybe not better, but certainly as good, Gillen admitted reluctantly. And he's younger, Pauline smiled. Thank you for that reminder, Halt told her. Then he turned back to Horace and Cassandra. Think about it. Could Maddie be in safer hands? Will loves her. He's her godfather. He looks upon her as his niece, if not his surrogate daughter. You'd be entrusting her to his care, and you know he would die before he let any harm come to her. And Will doesn't die easily, Horace observed. He was beginning to see the logic in Halt's idea. When he thought about it, he knew Maddie would be safe with Will watching over her. Halt sensed the change in Horace's attitude. He pressed his advantage. On top of that, you've said yourself that she's rebellious and difficult. Maybe she needs the discipline that life as an apprentice would bring. I'm not saying she'd do the full 5-year apprenticeship. A year should be enough, just so she wins her bronze oak leaf. The experience will do her a lot of good. Cassandra had drawn breath to reply, but now she stopped and a thoughtful look came over her face. That's true, she said softly. She had a mental picture of Maddie backchatting Will, and finding out how such behavior could rebound on her. Will would take no nonsense from an apprentice, even one he loved. Cassandra, Pauline said, and the princess looked at the graceful blonde, for a moment seeing her old friend Alice. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with your father when you wanted to go to Erida to ransom Eric. I told him, and I'll tell you now, that a queen-to-be has to do these things, has to take chances, has to get out into the world. You can't rule properly from an ivory tower. This is a good idea all around. Cassandra found herself nodding. She came to a decision, looking at Horace, and saw the agreement in his eyes. As always, he knew what she was thinking. Yes, she said briefly. There is one small problem you're all ignoring, Gillen said. She's a girl. We've never had a girl in the Rangers. Maybe it's time we did have one, Halt said. Pauline looked at him with absolute approval. How far her crusty, grim-faced, traditional-minded husband had come, she thought. But, Gillen began. He was lost for words until he thought of an objection. She's small. How would she ever draw an 80-pound bow, and that's our principal weapon? I'm small, Halt said. So's Will. But girls have a different muscle structure than boys, Gillen said. He looked apologetically at Cassandra and Pauline. I'm not being biased against girls here, it's just a physical fact. In general, we're more heavily muscled than you. And Maddie is a slightly built girl. She'd never build up the muscle mass that you need to shoot a longbow. Well, we'll just have to find a way around that, Halt replied. Maybe change our thinking a little. On the other hand, girls are lighter on their feet than boys. She'll be excellent at silent movement and camouflage. She's agile, she's nimble, and those are all qualities that a ranger needs. He could see Gillen was struggling with the concept. He smiled to himself. It was actually an idea that he'd been nursing for some months. Not specifically concerning Maddie, but as a general concept. He had been aware that there was a current shortage of suitable apprentices candidates, as Gillen had mentioned, and he'd begun to think that the Corps was ignoring a potential source of such people. Half the 15-year-olds in the kingdom were girls. Some of them had to be suitable candidates. There were no female rangers simply because there never had been. That in itself was not a good reason. It might well be time to blow away the cobwebs and let in some new thinking. And who better to sponsor such a new idea than Holt himself? After all, along with Crowley, he had reformed the court many years ago. Maybe it was time for a little more reforming. As to Gillen's main objection, the difficulty of finding a girl strong enough to pull a longbow, Mattie was ideally suited to demonstrate an alternative solution. "I wonder, could you release your daughter from her quarters for an hour or so?" he asked Cassandra and Horace. "I want her to show Gillen something." Alright, so that's it. Looks like Cassandra and Horace have agreed to let their daughter, the Crown Princess Madeline, be apprenticed to Will as a ranger for at least a year. So I guess we'll see where that goes in the next couple chapters. God bless and have a good one.